Thanks, Goldie, and thank you so much for those profound discussions and really relevant discussions, Niharika and Carsten. Really provocative interventions, I think, giving us much to reflect on during these very difficult times. Apologies for the loud noise in the background. You've both demonstrated powerfully in these talks the ways in which social theory and research can be used to make sense of the current context, as well as how these theories can be newly framed and analyzed with all that's being revealed and intensified with the pandemic. Whilst, as you say, Goldie, and you have both said, these are not exceptional times in the sense that structural inequality remains. The fissures and injustices of racial capitalism are being laid bare. Niharika, your breathtaking analysis of the everyday structural exclusions operating in India, as well as the military occupation of Kashmir, offers a highly pertinent intervention, along with your discussion of the pandemic as war narrative that has been mobilized by the authoritarian Indian state. As you note, it is a narrative that makes lives expendable and further entrenches socio-political divides, obfuscating systemic forms of oppression and inequality while creating binaries of us and them, which bolster the state's evasion of responsibility, of course. And as you've aptly illustrated, it is used to strengthen and legitimize the siege of Kashmir with a settler colonial logic. Carsten, your excellent discussion of biopolitics is equally fitting for these times, drawing on the framing of biopolitics as differentiated vulnerability, which I think is really apt. And you've noted that it is intrinsically connected to racism and capitalism, of course, but you've illustrated that the current situation, whilst it is not particularly exceptional within a biopolitical framework, in that the state is doing what it's designed to do, you've also offered a nuanced, critical perspective that I think veers from the normativity framing classical conceptions of biopolitics, because you've called for an emancipatory, democratic biopolitics, which I think is a very, very pertinent critical intervention. And you've strengthened this discussion by what you've termed populist biopolitics, which really, I suppose, is a counter concept or degeneration of democratic biopolitics. So thank you so much for these excellent discussions. And I have a few questions, but I will also, we'll open it up to questions from the audience soon. So please put in your questions into the chat. I don't see any yet, so I will come to those soon. And I think Goldie will jump in. But Niharika, I wanted to start with a question for you. Although, as you say, the rhetoric of war, which has been mobilized by the state, it enforces the state of emergency and exceptionality. As you note, these are not exceptional times. With or without the pandemic, authoritarianism and militarism remain. Would you say that this was inevitable? This discourse was inevitable in terms of the Indian state's response? I mean, even a welcomed occurrence. I mean, is it a continuation of the everyday militarized nationalist discourse mobilized by the fascist government?
Thank you, Caryn. Thank you, first of all, for your really kind words and for the really generative engagement that you've just done. I'm really grateful. It's really, I think it's so useful, and it's a great feeling to have someone read your work so closely, and that sort of support and solidarity within academia is really something that I dearly cherish. So thank you so much for that. And a really interesting question, and to just briefly frame my response, I wouldn't see or answer or approach this question in terms of inevitability. And I'm going to more think about how it was unsurprising that such a narrative was used, precisely because it's not just in India, but we can see across different contexts, across continents as well, how different leaders for their own political ends have mobilized this language in very many ways. And of course, pandemic is not the first instance wherein the war language is being used to describe non-wartime events. But it only goes on to show how normal it is to just, in contexts which are not of armed conflict, how normal it is to use a language that gives you a sense as if we are perpetually in conflict. And what both embodied as well as like, what does that make you feel? So I think it's really important to have that discussion as an embodied, as an affective response. And what does that do to citizens of that state, right? So I think in terms of that, it wasn't definitely surprising. And of course, with the current the state and the government in India, it's a very their project is an inherently militarized project, right? So the Hindu nationalists have their wings which train people into self-defense, and they have these militarized narratives of expansion and of this new imperialism and the empire building that has to happen. And that in itself has, I think, underpinning that logic and underpinning that project is militarization too, along with discourses of supremacy and nationalism. So in a way, it wasn't really surprising because that is the trajectory that has been followed. And we've only seen this. I think it's also quite hard to say whether was it less before or more now, but there has been a substantial rise in the way militarism is the everyday militarism, specifically in language, in the sort of the praise of the army, as if the armed forces are put on a pedestal, that they're basically next to God, that there's nothing wrong that they can do. And what does that do to just completely ignore and obfuscate the violence that happens? So I think it's really, to put in context, a way to respond to your question would be that it was it is in a way a continuation of what's going on.
Absolutely. Thank you for that excellent framing and reframing, really, of my question. Thank you for that. And Carsten, similarly, in terms of looking at the state of whether this is exceptional, and as we've said, it really isn't in many ways. I wanted to draw on your discussion of the ways in which biopolitical theory can draw from this context. And you clearly demonstrate the limitations of conceiving of biopolitics as solely a matter of repressive state power. And you offer, as I said, a much more nuanced interpretation. But would you say that this is unique in terms of populist biopolitics? Is it unique to COVID? Or is it something that's being revealed with the pandemic? And I'm also wondering, connected to that, what role social media plays in the rise of this?
Thank you very much, Caryn, for this excellent question. And I would say, no, this kind of populist biopolitics, which I described, is not something new to COVID. In fact, kind of one of the most prominent examples where it last occurred was the AIDS crisis, which I had briefly mentioned in my talk. So in the public responses to the AIDS crisis, where especially in the 80s, but still long after, homophobic shaming and exclusion, and homosexuals, as they were referred to by the general public, were seen as a threat to public health. And therefore, views and politics were supported to have very repressive means to limit the spread of HIV, like forced testing, incarceration, all of these things were debated. But stigma continued regarding HIV. So we, like here, this is a very clear-cut case of these populist biopolitics understood as this shaming in the name of the people. If you compare that now to COVID, one has to be careful, because HIV at the beginning was never seen as a general concern for the wider public, except for this kind of frightening the health of the public, but it was always seen as a gay problem, as a problem of the homosexuals. And therefore, never many resources and media attention was spent on the issue as it is with COVID now. So we have a wholly different situation of how populist biopolitics play out. In the case of HIV, it was very severe and dominating the whole discussion, while in the case of COVID, it is really more, at least in the case of Germany, where what I'm talking about, and the US, it seems to me that it's more an accompanying phenomenon and not central to the governmentality and the biopolitics of COVID. Even though I think what Niharika explained about India might be called maybe a state usage of populist biopolitical narratives. Maybe we can discuss about it if that makes sense. And social media, on the one hand, for kind of this very limited occurrence of populist biopolitics in COVID, which I draw on, there it was crucial, because also at the time of the lockdown, all of the social interactions were mediated through social media. So this stay the fuck at home, etc., that was all social media and the discussions there. However, I don't think that this is one of the phenomena where social media is the crucial reason for its production and existence, because overall it is still understandable, this reaction. It is not completely outside the realm of reason, and social media is, as a generative force, more important for these totally crazy conspiracy theorists who think that Corona is an invention of Bill Gates and the QAnon people, etc., etc. So all these bubbles and rabbit holes of the death of social media, where people get fully stuck and then framed in these weird conspiracy narratives, this is more connected to social media in its genealogy. These things couldn't exist in this way without social media, while the populist biopolitics of COVID, they would still exist without social media. And so kind of the loudest voice with regards to COVID, which is also called populist in Germany at the moment, are these people who say COVID doesn't exist and the government is limiting our freedom, and who are having all these crazy conspiracy stories. But I would, to differentiate it, I would call this an anti-modern Corona protest, because what we see there is more a general dissatisfaction with modernity as a whole and alienation processes. Yeah, but for this, social media is more important.
Thanks for that, Carsten. I wanted to encourage the audience to please submit questions. I'm not sure whether Goldie, you have any questions, or Niharika, Carsten, you have any comments or questions for each other. Otherwise, I can go on and ask another question to you each. Niharika, you do? Is that a yes?
No, that was a yes to, you can go on.
Another question?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
Okay.
Why not?
No problem. Yeah, but please do submit. So Niharika, I have another question for you. And really, I want to keep this as open as possible in terms of what you take from it. But really speaking to your perspective as a transnational feminist scholar, I'm interested in looking at the ways, I mean, you did point to this in your talk, but I wonder if you can expand on it a little bit in terms of how this discourse of war and how it's being currently mobilized really reinforces aggressive, heteropatriarchal, racialized discourses and narratives. particularly in terms of the exclusions it bolsters. And then I think I'm actually, so I'm interested in that, but I think I'm also more interested in looking at the possibilities it perhaps opens for solidarity, particularly for transnational solidarity.
Thank you again for that. So I think just to expand a bit on the reinforcing of heteropatriarchal and racialized narratives that already were present. So I'll just start off with an example. You know, when you have a lockdown and suddenly you are told that this is an urgent warlike situation, and given a couple hours until after that everything will be shut down, it induces a sense of panic, and suddenly everyone's asked to stay at home. So in this framing, what is the home, and what is this formulation of the home that the state is asking us to stay in? First of all, it's a very heteropatriarchal unit, right? It's a family in a very heteronormative sense, precisely because a lot of queer families are not limited to this idea of a normative household. So, what are those exclusions that are formed when there is an utterance that stay at home? And at the same time, where are those spaces wherein people who are abused or are being constantly violated within the home spaces? Where do they go? And then there was, I think, in many contexts, we've published this on the platform on engenderings as well, that there was a systematic defunding of shelters of domestic violence as well during this time, when there was a spike in such cases. So I think the exclusions that are made through, I'm not saying definitely that there's a causal relation, that this is why it happens, but perhaps it's really important to say what those utterances exclude and what kind of norms are being reinforced in that imagination of the home and the household that the state is asking us to, stay at home with. And that's definitely not just limited to the Indian context, but I think there have been so many discussions here in the UK as well about the household and what is a household, what is a unit. So I think in a way it's really generative, precisely because we've come back to the questions that have been that we've stayed with for long, and we're learning from a lot of theorists who have really engaged in these questions and how the concepts can be exclusionary in the way they are understood and conceptualized. But so I find that somewhat hopeful in a world that just seems so hopeless at times. But I'm also, and I think what really lies there, and I was reading this, there's this very new interesting volume called Revolutionary Feminism. And it is a series of interviews with feminists who've done work across decolonization, across anti-racist politics, anti-capitalist politics. And I think in a particular interview, Gail Lewis is also, when she's thinking of organizing, and there is an emphasis that she makes on going beyond the individual as an organizing unit. So, instead of perhaps there comes the transnational perspective, wherein we are thinking, rethinking the purposes of our organizing. Like, what are the values that we're fighting for, or what are the values that we're perhaps collectivizing towards? And I think that just, in many ways, that just takes us a step back to just, have some time, do a rethink about what we want. And of course, the mobilization, as Carsten also pointed out, that, the left sort of, capture of this moment that we imagined hasn't happened. And perhaps, I don't know, it looks like a very bleak situation, but I'm really hopeful. But perhaps it's really time to also go back to some of the visions that are present in, with feminist activists and with academics who've already given us ways of engaging, but also they're asking us to problematize it in the current moment. So I think there lies a bit of hope that I see. But also, I think that's a very, very contested term, but also, really, as I mean, it just, you have to continue practicing it, right? So it's a practice word, it's a doing. So I think keeping that in mind, I see some potentialities.
Absolutely. I think the doing of radical hope is most needed. So thank you for that. I think, yeah, certainly needed right now.